Everything okay? I'm just going to carry on now. I got a I got an email from Routledge yesterday with a £35 sterling royalties for that book, which I co-edited with Declan. So that's going to make me rich in the end. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to all of the organisers for asking me to speak. As many of you are well aware, I've been involved with this project, and it's for runners for many years now. I think it was 2012, 2013 when Marguerite first asked me to come to Nijmegen. And for me, this research environment has been extremely stimulating, fruitful. Trying to work across national historiographies can be quite frustrating, even though ultimately, hopefully, fruitful and rewarding. But this network is really important for me in being an audience for my voice, because it's quite hard sometimes when you're writing comparative or transnational work to know for whom you're writing. So I always think if I'm writing something which is understandable and appreciated by this group, then actually it doesn't matter if I'm attacked by people for not taking one perspective or another, because sometimes you have to make those kind of decisions. So this is a really important group to me. And actually what I'm presenting today owes a considerable debt to you, considerably, collectively, and in many cases, individually as well. So I have a timer on. It's going to ping on 10 and 20 and 30 minutes. I'm aiming to speak for between 30 and 35 minutes, and then hopefully we can have questions afterwards. I'll set a brief historical context, and then look at the commemorative culture around the 1860s Hunger Years in Finland before zeroing in on some of the specific memorials, and then finally positing some ideas about what all that might mean. And I usually start with this kind of disclaimer. This is Åsmund Vinje, from a Norwegian author from the 1860s, but he says it's a dangerous undertaking to write about other countries because there's lots about them we don't understand. And I hope and I believe that it's very important. There's value in getting or giving an external perspective when you're dealing with a national historiography, but especially when dealing with an event which costs the lives of up to 150,000 people. I do give this perspective humbly and respectfully, and I'm motivated by curiosity rather than trying to necessarily problematize or criticize what has gone before. Also at this stage, I wouldn't have anywhere that would be not a foreign country, I'd say in some respects. So everywhere I'm dealing with is a little bit like that. And just to give you some context for the quotation that I used for the title of the talk, this is the height of the Great Finnish Famine, one of the only photographs we have from the period, therefore pretty ubiquitous in articles and books about the period. But there's a little quotation here about a donation from a Swiss based benefactor to the town of Hämeenlinna in Häme. And when she gave this money to help the famine victims in Häme, the local newspaper said that her ardent pity for this province would be held forever in the memory. So what I'm interested in really is the extent to which these Great Hunger Years themselves, let alone any individual acts of kindness, are actually or have been kept forever in the memory. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Forgive me if this is very obvious to you. It's always a bit hard to know how to pitch the basic level of history, but just to give some background, because it's important, especially if we take this from an Irish comparative context. It's in 1809, Finland goes from being a part of the Swedish kingdom to being an autonomous Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire. So during the 19th century, Finland is actually part of the Russian Empire, but developing organs of statehood. So a government of its own based here in Helsinki. The university moves to Helsinki. The Bank of Finland, which I'm kind of looking at now from my window, develops its own currency from the 1860s. So a large degree of what we would call home rule. over its own economic policy, its own infrastructure and industrial relations and so on. And it's important because when famine strikes in the 1860s, there isn't any sort of narrative or desire or reason really on the part of the governing elite in Helsinki to blame the imperial power or to attribute what's going on to the imperial power. On the other hand, the government in Helsinki does treat the Finnish provinces as needing modernization and education in a way that we would actually be very familiar with from some of the rhetoric over the Irish during the Irish famine, but I'm not going to talk about that today. The cause of this crisis in the 1860s is often given as frost and therefore God, and that's how the narrative develops. So it's a natural disaster. This is how it's presented, and of course that kind of lets the elites who are running Finland off the hook in terms of what they were able to do. They were helpless in the face of God's power, is the kind of narrative that develops. And I would just also add that the 1860s are a time of great upheaval in Europe. These nation building projects are causing wars. There's the American Civil War and the economic consequences of that. There's famines in India, Algeria. You know, the 1860s are incredibly, well, for us, interesting, but at the time, a time of great upheaval. And also, simultaneously with these crisis years in Finland, we have famine crises in Sweden and in well, Estonia, Livonia, these territories, and also neighboring governorates of Russia. So it is also a regional issue. And just to give you some context here as well, this is from Cormac O'Grada's short history, a useful table for me, because sometimes it is questioned. I had this quite a lot when I was co-editing the book about Ukraine and Ireland. That okay, in Finland, only 1.4 million, 140,000 people died, or there was this kind of competitive element, which I've never really wanted to be involved in. But if you do want to set the Finnish famine in some kind of global historical context, you can see here that in terms of percentage death rate, there's been no greater mortality apart from in Kampuchea. And it doesn't come up to the Irish levels from the 1840s, but it is, I would say, a very significant human catastrophe, which deserves to be examined out with any kind of national paradigm, or, it doesn't just deserve to be in a national history. It should be treated as a significant event in European history, for example. And I think that's the way I've tried to treat it. So what I'm trying to get to is how the Hunger Years are remembered in Finland. And I'll just present a few of my observations on this before we get on to the actual memorials. I'd say there's very limited coverage of the Great Hunger Years in general histories of Finland. Sometimes one sentence, sometimes not mentioned at all, in a way which for an Irish reader is really surprising. And this doesn't really matter whether you're reading sources in either of the national languages of Finland or in English, or probably in any other language. It's just not really a significant part of the national narrative. Again, from my own experience of being a parent of kids in school in Finland, there was one lesson in 7th grade, although my younger son, who's now in high school, was doing a comparative. He had a lesson last week where they compared the Finnish and Irish famines. And apparently I'm on the Wikipedia page in Finnish for the Great Finnish Famine's memorials, and all of his classmates were telling him about that. But that's quite nice to know. But in general, it's not something that's particularly well discussed in school. there's relatively sparse historical coverage, and of course I need to mention Antti here and scholars and historians associated with Antti since the 1990s. And since I came back to Finland in 2010, it's been this group of scholars that have been my support network in a way, who've been kind of convincing me that this is worth pursuing, and that I'm not some kind of mad foreigner doing it. But there is some very good work done from the economic and social history perspective. But again, when you compare it to the historiography of the Great Irish Famine, it's something that when you arrive here with that background, you can see there's quite a lot of work to be done, or a lot of interesting work that could be done. And I've used this quotation here, again, just to give a little bit of an overview or a little bit of a taste of the way in which the famine was remembered later on. It was a time, according to the Finnish nationalist historiography, where the people pulled together, where these Finnish national qualities of forbearance and perseverance and hard work, they all crystallized into this nation. So separate people all around the country. If anything, the famine helped create a nation. And this quotation, I mean, it's not true. Recent research by Mika Vuorela, for example, but also Antti has dealt with this, that interpersonal crimes, homicide, robberies, they all went up. Of course, you would absolutely expect that. But this was ignored and even denied in the history of the famine. And here you can see a kind of unflattering comparison with Ireland in the 1890s about what happened during the Great Irish Famine. And that's partly because the history of Finland was written by people in this, actually in this building, partly, and also this university, the same class of men who were running the country. And of course, they were able to write the history in a way that didn't put anything they did in the 1860s into a bad light, let's say it like that. And I'll come on to Agaton Meurman, one of the leading nationalist writers in a subsequent slide. But there was certainly an attempt, even in the 1890s, to correct anybody who started to suggest that there was a misgovernance in Finland in the 1860s. I've already mentioned the lack of an oppression narrative. There's also a lack of a diaspora, especially transatlantic emigration that isn't a feature of the Great Finnish Famine, rather internal migration or migration to parts of the Russian Empire. So there isn't this emergence of kind of embittered immigrant communities, for example. There's also a very quick demographic and economic recovery. You don't have that demographic crisis like in Ireland, where the population keeps getting lower. There's a small notch in the population graph in Finland, but then it continues as normal, and as if nothing would have happened actually after 30 years. The population is more or less as it would have been. And the policies that are enacted in the 1860s, it's very hard to know whether they're cause or effect in terms of the famine, in terms of a kind of chaotic poor law, chaotic local governance. But this is then presented as the birth of modernity in Finland. So the 1860s are almost celebrated as an era where Finnish national identity was created, where Finnish language became one of the official languages of government instead of Swedish, or alongside Swedish. So all of these kind of things are remembered of the 1860s, but not really the famine. And the one thing I really noticed when I first came here was there's no national Finnish famine memorial. And I was regularly told that there were no memorials of any kind. So I first visited Finland in 1998. And of course, those of you who remember back then what it was like in Ireland, there was what Cormac O'Grady referred to as famine fever. There were lots of memorials being erected, being inaugurated in Mayo, especially. There, the National Famine Memorial is there in Murrisk. Other local initiatives were taking place. So I had these kind of twin perspectives. The first thing I knew about Finnish history was that there was a famine, And also I was kind of living in the context of this great explosion of commemoration in Ireland. So it was really noticeable to me when I came to Finland that there was not this commemorative culture. I'm going to skip over this quite quickly, but this is just, again, it's kind of signaling a start of a new section of the talk. But this is from an event we had in Belfast, actually, in 2014, this mural in New Lodge. I don't know if it's still there. And this is, again, my own kind of personal background. This is my family's, it's where my cousins live, where my family would have lived in the 1840s in Attimas. And this is referred to by some people as the famine village, but it's not really in our family, it's just empty houses. But I suppose on a personal level, I was always interested in famine. So it could affect the way I saw things in Finland when I came here. I was expecting things to be here, which weren't. And I started to wonder why. It was also then, of course, in 1997 when I started my PhD, so I was probably more intellectually curious and receptive to these kind of debates at that time. So this was the context in which I arrived in Finland. Murrisk is there. Later on, there was actually the building from Attimas as well, which was put into New York, and then the well-known one, Gillespie's installation there in Dublin. So quite significant pieces of public art, some of which are in very public places. This certainly is something that doesn't happen in Finland. There's no commemoration, for example, in Helsinki. There are sites of memory to do with the famine in these bigger towns like Helsinki, Tampere, Espoo, but no memorial. So actually the largest municipality in Finland with a memorial is Lahti, which is the 8th biggest municipality in Finland. But even there, it's not where you would see it unless you went to look for it. It's quite well hidden at a mass grave site. The memorial in Hämeenlinna is maybe the one which is most seen, but I don't think anybody knows what it is. It's very accessible. It's kind of in the middle of town, again in a former graveyard, but it's nothing like Gillespie's, or even the one the one that's at Tonehenge in Stephen's Green, for example, the older famine memorial, these kind of things. So it did strike me like to wonder, where would a Finnish famine memorial be if there were to be a national famine memorial? And I only kind of use this as a link because one contender would be the municipality of Parkano. And you can see from this map, the darker the color is the harder hit the municipality. And Parkano, quite near Tampere, is one of the municipalities which lost the highest, in fact, lost the highest number of people percentage-wise. But this here is the memorial in the graveyard in Parkano. It's a very anonymous little red granite stone, just with 1868 written on it. It's a contemporary stone that was left there by people at the time. And if you're looking for it, this is where I found it a couple of summers ago, behind this bench in the graveyard in Parkano. So I've noticed recently that the local newspaper started to discuss, should it be made more prominent? Again, it looks in a way like I'm mocking this or saying this is strange, and I'm not. I'm just really interested in this difference between how prominent the memorials are in Ireland. And this made me also think back to the fact that in Attimas, for example, this is Bonafinglas cemetery, where anybody of my family who died during the famine is buried. They would have come down from Ballina or Ardnaree by boat, probably, and from the workhouse, and just be buried here in a mass grave. But here the memorials are, again, they're quite subtle. They're plaques or acknowledgements of where unburied children were, and so on. And actually, this is much more like how the memorials are in Finland. And I think if you get below this national level commemoration, the human response on a local level to these tragedies is quite similar and quite familiar. So when I go around these graveyards in Finland, and find small memorials to the famine. It's much more like this in Bonifinglas, for example. This again is quoting Agaton Meurman from his book Nälkävuodet, the Great Hunger Years, or Hungeråren, in the 1860s. I'm getting behind schedule now. And this isn't a still from Stand By Me. This is my students in the summer on the Riihimäki to St. Petersburg Railway. Oops. Sorry. It's very hard to be elegant with Zoom. In his book about the Hunger Years, Meurman mentioned the fact that as famine relief, roads, railways, and canals were built, and because of these lasting legacies of the people's work during the famine, there was no need for any other memorials. You can see on the right there that there are actually memorials to Meurman, but this is a really good summary of the attitude towards memorialization of the Great Finnish Famine. There's nothing heroic about it, in a sense, other than the fact that the infrastructure which allowed Finland to develop as a nation was created. So there's not this idea of famine roads as being a colonial imposition. It was rather work that had to be done because you couldn't be given free charity. You just had to work for your keep. And again, without trying to make some kind of heroic narrative, I've now logged over 100 famine memorials in Finland. These are on my Instagram page or on this website if you're interested to go and look at them in more detail. I've arranged them here by province in a kind of color-coded way. I found, or I charted the 100th one during the summer, and yeah. So the idea that there are no memorials to the famine in Finland is not correct. There is no huge public monument to the famine, but on a local level there is a lot. And just to give you that's our sort of the size of Ireland. So this is that's about half of Finland you can see on that map. There's nothing north of this, partly because the famine wasn't so severe there, but it is a very big space that these famine memorials are spread out in. And hopefully you can see there, at least I'm getting a, yeah, I'm just getting a, you can see there the memorials kind of mapped onto the severity of the famine, and there is a strong correlation there between where the famine was worst and where there is a famine memorial. And this is partly reflecting the idea that it's seen as a local tragedy, but not really considered to be part of the national narrative. And you can see examples of this in Ostrobothnia, for example, in this sort of middle western part, where two neighboring municipalities might have a memorial, but there isn't really a sense of anything beyond the individual municipality, that there isn't a shared experience or so. It's very much done on a local level. On the left there, I've kind of charted when these memorials were erected. There's quite a few, at least where I was able to find that out. There's a few there on the left-hand side that were from the 1860s themselves. There's a little spike there in the centenary decade, the 1960s, but very few. And I kind of let this go, and I thought in 2018 there would be another sort of spike in the number of famine memorials. But one very prosaic reason why the famine is not remembered maybe so well in Finland is that it's always 50 years ahead of independence. So in 1917, Finland gets independence. In 1918, there's a very bloody civil war, which makes the Irish Civil War look like a little playground skirmish. And so these are always 50 years out of step with the famine. So if there's public commemoration to be done, and if there's public funding for commemoration, I think that often goes to those more I suppose, more significant events in terms of how a nation is perceiving itself to be. Getting independence, full sovereignty over its own state is of course seen as somewhat more heroic than a famine. I'm just going to show you, because it's late on Friday afternoon, I'm just going to show you some examples from these memorials that I've found. The slides I jumped over there, you can see them. I presume the slides will be shared, but this is just, they were just giving you an example of how the memory was kept alive. So you can see in newspapers, for example, in the 1920s, 1930s, sites of memory are preserved, even though there may not be a memorial. And as the people of that generation with an actual memory of the time start to die, then there's more discussion about crystallizing these memories in the form of a memorial. And some of the memorials are using or referring to the material culture of the time, so the failure of food. These are 4 examples of quernstones from around Finland, which have been transformed into memorials to the 1860s. These are 4 examples of the mother motif, which in some other context I've alluded to Margaret Kelleher and her work on the feminization of famine. Quite interesting how often this trope comes up. I think in the article I wrote in the volume that was edited by Marguerite and Emily and Una, I maybe refer to this. But nothing very ornate. But you know, you can see these are all from the 1860s. Yes, these are all from the 1960s, and they're much more invested with symbolism, I suppose, than the earlier ones. But nothing, you know, they're all in fairly anonymous corners of graveyards, usually close to where the mass graves were, and you don't stumble across them by accident. There have been some which I would call like artworks or commissioned pieces of sculpture. The one on the bottom left there from Mansala is this very common trope in Finland of migration, internal migration in Finland, but often again it's this the empty basket or the broken stems of rye in Tohmajärvi on the right. And the one in Jämsä on the top left is reflecting the broken life cycle. So this is kind of abstract, but this is very rare, abstract piece of art as a famine memorial. And it's also quite common to find these memorials near sites related to relief work. So the kind of Stonehenge type memorial on the left was a bridge that was built as relief work during the famine. Similarly, a bridge on the bottom left in Viitasaari, the canal builders on the top right in Varkaus, and one, actually one of the first ones I visited, having been told by Antti Häkkinen about it, this contemporary stone from the 1860s commemorating the long road that was built in Ostrobothnia for a wage of very watered down flour. Cold flour basically was the wage for this road. But again, I stress this is not seen as a colonial imposition on an oppressed people. It's just seen as a normal part of poor relief in Finland. So there isn't necessarily a negative association with famine roads. Just moving on from the theme of famine roads, these are all memorials that you would find along the skeleton track, as it was colloquially known, the St. Petersburg to Riihimäki railway. Quite a lot of memorials along there. Tens of thousands of people are said to have perished as a result of hunger and starvation, but of course also communicable diseases. And one of the shameful things about the famine is that the budget for the St. Petersburg-Riihimäki railway was, it came in vastly under budget because of the fact that humans were used basically for a slave wage to build it as famine relief. This is not something that is promoted in the nationalist historiography. There's also an interesting issue here with this quite well-known book, which was translated into several languages by Aki Ollikainen, called Nälkävuosi, the Year of Hunger in Finnish, and White Hunger in most other languages, playing up the snow element. Ollikainen himself wasn't really aware of the Great Finnish Famine until visiting his wife's family's dead relatives at Christmas in Haapajärvi, and then he saw the famine memorial there and started to imagine the famine years, and that memorial therefore produced this literature. The literature is now currently producing a film. So I think it's interesting to see the way in which these memorials can inspire maybe a more general knowledge or a more general collective memory of the famine experience. Most of the famine memorials are in churchyards. I'd say about 70 or 80% are in churchyards, and often on the middle one there is saying, "Give us this day our daily bread." The one on the left is not a biblical quotation, but it's a quotation from the book Saarijärven Paavo, where Paavo is a peasant, a Finnish peasant who trusts in God. He's not like a rebellious Irish peasant. He's a resourceful, cussed and determined figure who represents the Finnish people in their struggle against the climate. And that's a quotation there where if you trust in God, he won't abandon you. So again, very much going back to what I remember from my Scottish history classes in university, and why the Scots didn't rebel during the Land War period. The priests or the ministers acted as a wet cloth on the minds of the people. And this is why I have this Scottish Highlands image, and also I have an original now behind me. But I am partly inspired by Highland history and by how the Highland clearances are remembered. I think there's an equally strong comparative thread that you could build on there when you're looking at the Finnish famine memorials. And I also just want to show you, these are hero graves in the background. This is the famine memorial in Kärsämäki, but these are white people who fell during the Civil War from the white side, were repatriated to their home parishes and given a very dignified resting place. And many cemeteries in Finland would have this type of arrangement. And where famine memorials have been erected more recently, they're often in the vicinity of these hero graves, as they're known. So it contributes in some ways to this hegemonic white narrative of Finnish history. And one thing I would like to argue is that not that I'd like to say that the Reds would have won the Civil War, but just imagining if the Reds would have won the Civil War, there could easily have developed what was developing in 1916, 1917, a red narrative which did put blame onto the bourgeois politicians in Helsinki for causing this crisis. That was wiped out by the white victory in the Civil War. So the white narrative of a stoic people fighting nature has become the dominant national narrative in Finland. This is another example in Lapinlahti of the famine memorial being right next to the Civil War graves. The final slide here then, before I just conclude, is to do with the length of the crisis. And you notice earlier when I showed Cormac's table, it just said the famine in Finland was 1 year. One thing we've been trying, Antti, I'm following in Antti's footsteps always, but this was a decade long, at least, of a country becoming ever more precarious. If you look at the famine memorials all around the country, you'll see they're different dates. And they go from 1862 to 1869. And I think if you put all of those together, you can build up a picture of a country that is getting ever closer to the brink of an absolute disaster, which is what happens in 1867, 68. But these memorials, when you take them together, they give us something to add to the archival sources from the time, especially from consuls, foreign consuls, for example, in Finland. say, why aren't they doing more to help the people? Why are they allowing this potential disaster to develop? You see this already from 64, 65 until the final calamitous year, 68. So I just have a few, for 1 minute, I will just put these conclusions up here. I've mentioned most of these already, but I think the famine memorials do contribute either to hegemonic view of Finnish history, because they are situated in the proximity of hero graves, for example. The memorial in Asikkala, which I've now put the picture over, has everything on one memorial. It has the Civil War, the Winter War, the Continuation War, and the famine, as if these are all crises that the Finnish people have overcome together. And they have the modern nation that they now enjoy. But I think, as I said, a red victory in 1918 would have changed the memory of the famine. Maybe it's not useful to think about what might have happened, but I find it interesting to at least wonder about it. And again, just to put everything in a nutshell there, my key contention would be from an Irish point of view. I think it's axiomatic that a famine cannot be caused by nature alone. But for a Finnish nationalist, nature was the main cause. And the extent of self-government in Finland is a key factor in the differences in the narrative and the subsequent commemoration in Finland. So I'll wrap up there, and maybe you have questions. If you want me to go into more detail on any of those, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.